Uh, okay, does that look right?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, I'll leave on the next slide as well because yeah, I think you can see the main slide big enough. So we started off talking about how the biblical worldview, the Bible message, with its understanding of who God is and therefore who human beings are, and therefore how we should then live, how this message transformed Europe and made Europe Europe. And so that the concept of Europe, of the people living in that peninsula of Western Eurasia that we often call erroneously a continent, that the way in which these people perceive reality was shaped by the biblical worldview, very imperfectly, but nevertheless, there was a God in heaven. He was a good, loving, forgiving God. And although there was much to be desired in the kind of Christianity that emerged during the Middle Ages, nevertheless, it was based on a worldview that understood one God, human beings created in his image, and therefore needing to live by the commandment to love our neighbor, even love our enemy, as well as to see his to work towards his kingdom coming. So this was the narrative that really made Europe Europe in the first place. And we asked ourselves, what happens when Europe forgets that story, rejects the Bible? And I quoted a man by the name of Leslie Newbegin, who'd been a missionary in India most of his life. He came back to England, and he began to see how that back in Europe, we had been cut off from our biblical roots. And he said, what happens now is that you go back to pre-Christian realities. And that is really what has been happening. We see a lot of Eastern ideas taking over in Europe as well. As G.K. Chesterton said, what happens when people stop believing in God? They don't believe in nothing. They begin to believe everything. And so we have a Europe that is now a secular and multi-religious Europe. That is, we've got all these ideas living here now in Europe. And it comes as a shock to people like some of you who would come back to Europe on the first time to Europe. You might expect you're coming to a Christian continent, and will hit you in the face how much we have lost our way. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that we're without hope. That we then moved on to the Reformation yesterday, and we talked about how the Reformation recovered very important aspects of this Christian worldview and the deep impact it had on almost every area of life. We could have spent a lot more time just talking about Geneva and John Calvin and his influence on the politics that actually has shaped so much of the politics of our world today in terms of understanding the rule of law, constitution, balance of powers, the separation of church and state, things that a lot of people think came out of the Enlightenment, but no, they had reformational roots, talking about human rights, etc., etc. So now I want to shift and look at what happened after the Second World War and the influence of Christian thinking in shaping the international order that has dominated for the last 70 years, but is now being challenged in a huge way by the man in the Kremlin. And we've come to the end of an age that has been dominantly an age of peace in Europe, and that even though it was dominated by Cold War as well, but the European nations were those belonging to the EU, not been at war with each other, whereas previously France and Germany particularly were constantly fighting like alley cats and dragging the rest of the world into their fights. And that produced the First World War and then the Second World War. And So we're going to ask ourselves the question, who won the peace? We're going to be looking at the post-war era, and then we're going to be looking at what happened when communism collapsed. And then eventually we'll come back and look at what can we make of the current conflict going on between Ukraine and Russia. Is this just a local skirmish? Is this something we just stand on the sidelines and hope for the best, or are we all engaged in it? So the question I'm asking is, who won the peace? You see, a lot of people think that the after the war here in Europe, when the Allied troops came through, and there's a picture there at the top left-hand corner of people waving, troops coming through a town very close to where I lived for 43 years, where the Heidelberg base is. This is one of the towns where the troops came through exactly like this, and everybody turned out on the streets to welcome them. And the soldiers gave out chocolates and cigarettes and kisses, as you can see there. And everybody then went home and lived happily ever after. That's not the way it happened. Actually, Europe was a very divided continent, and very hurt continent, was suffering a very severe case of post-trauma stress disorder. How do you heal a continent like that? There's a picture here of Dresden, bombed by the Allies. The Allies, you know, we might think, depending on our backgrounds, all the Allies were the good guys. Not everything the Allies did was good, and we always, as Christians, we need to constantly be prepared to be prophetic within our own situations, and when we recognize our good people are doing bad things, we need to say it. You know, we've all been influenced by our own upbringing, the way our schools have taught us to look at history, for example. I grew up in New Zealand, which was part of the British Commonwealth. Actually, when I was born, it was part of the British Empire that later got changed to the British Commonwealth. Now, I married a Dutch woman. She didn't grow up in that Commonwealth. And her father refused to ever speak English because of the terrible things the English did to the Boers, that was the Dutch settlers in South Africa, during the Boer War. I said, what do you mean? We were the good guys. New Zealanders went and fought with the British in the Boer War. The Dutch were supporting the Boers at the other side. And we never learned in school that the English invented concentration camps, not the Germans, the English, during the Boer War. And so, you know, we need to learn to rise above our nationalism, as well as our denominationalism, to see the bigger picture, to look at the world the way God looks at the world, at least attempt to. And so when we look at the bombing of Dresden here, it probably was a war crime, but of course the victors never faced trial. But this was totally against the Geneva War Conventions that we talked about yesterday, and the evangelical Henri Dunant was behind those. And but here, civilians were targeted, and men, women, and children perished in the severe firestorm that happened. Of course, you know, the Germans had done the same thing to Britain, to London, and to Coventry and other places. And so the problem is that war very often makes you tempt to become come down to the same level as the enemy, and we compromise on our convictions and principles. And so Germany was a destroyed nation, but even Western nations, they were divided, families were divided. Everybody knew people who'd been killed during the war. People had to live with their disabilities, with their wounds from the war, and not only physical wounds, but psychological wounds as well. My son married a woman whose mother was German, and that whole family had been so disrupted because the men folk didn't come back from the war. And so the women got new men, and then some of the men folk turned up. And you can imagine how confusing that all was. And so Europe was suffering from post-trauma stress disorder. Where could it get healing? Now, there's other pictures of a statue. It's in the city of Rotterdam, which you may know was bombed by Hitler with a blitzkrieg in May 1940. And the whole center of the city was bombed out. And Hitler told Holland it was going to do Amsterdam next unless they capitulated. Well, the center of Amsterdam, where I am right now, still has many buildings that date back from the 17th century and even earlier, only because the Dutch capitulated. If they hadn't, this would have all been bombed as well, and the center of Amsterdam would have been so totally changed, just like the center of Rotterdam has been, and you have many modern buildings there now. But we can still use a map of 1544 to find our way around the center of Amsterdam, as I often do when I take people on walks here. But this statue by a sculptor, French sculptor by the name of Zadkine, shows this anguished figure, hands raised to the heavens, with a whole heart bombed out, if you like. The sun is shining through that hole there. This depicts not only the city of Rotterdam, but we could say this is really what Europe was like after the war, anguished. The heart had been bombed out. And so, although we all know who won the war, we want to know who won the peace, because peace didn't come immediately. Peace was, well, those 5 years following the war were very fearful years, years of anguish there. The labor unions under the control of the Kremlin were trying to topple the new democracies of Italy and France, Spain, and so on, trying to unsettle, well, sorry, Spain was not a democracy then. It was a dictatorship under Franco. But the new peace that had come, or the new absence of war, had enabled the nations to begin to start towards democracy. But it was a very tense time as workers rose up against the governments. In fact, in France, there was a new government every 7 months in these years. And of course, Europe had been divided east and west. The big three, that is Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, who met in Yalta, agreed on how the Europe would be divided during this after the war. And Stalin got control of Central and Eastern Europe. And even though many of those people had been freed by Americans, the Americans had to let them go back under Russian control. Churchill, who was the third member, he felt like a fifth wheel very often. It was really between Roosevelt and Stalin that was going on. And so Europe itself was divided. And Stalin was rattling his saber, and they had now gotten the atomic bomb, just like the Americans. And there was a time actually happening about the time I was born in 1949, where he was trying to blockade Berlin, the Berlin blockade. And the Allies responded by starting an airlift, sending in planes taking off from Frankfurt, that is the western part of Germany that was under British and American and French control, flying it into the part of Berlin that was also under French, American, and British control, but it was surrounded by Russian control. And the only way they could bring in supplies was flying them in. And every few minutes, every 3 or 4 minutes, planes were taking off from Frankfurt to bring in food, clothing, coal, and all sorts of supplies to Berlin. Now, eventually, the Russians lifted that blockade because they saw it wasn't working, and but the Cold War was now getting underway, and so the story we're going to tell you this morning is of some Christian believers and the influence that they had through their Christian understanding as to what kind of Europe God wanted to see emerge after the Second World War. And it takes us to a part of France called Alsace-Lorraine, this top right-hand corner, if you like, that borders onto Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and Switzerland, that had been taken over by the Germans way back in 1870 when Bismarck invaded France, and that part of France became under German control. And this is where we meet the story of a man named Robert Schumann, this man here. And he's the key person we're going to talk about. When we take people on tours, as I mentioned a couple of times, we end up in this little town called Cassel. Can you see that here in this map? The top of the orange map there, Cassel, just outside Metz, just across the border from Luxembourg, it is. And this house was the house where Robert Schumann lived, opposite the church across the road, where he would go for Mass every day when he was there. He was a Catholic believer. And if you go there today, you can see the statue of these four men who are called the fathers of Europe. Robert de Gasperi, Alcide de Gasperi, he was an Italian. Robert Schumann, he was French, although he was born in Luxembourg, as we will hear. Jean Monnet, also a Frenchman, and Konrad Adenauer, the German. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't see what I was seeing. Here we are. These men are considered to be the fathers of Europe. And the reason why they're called that is that together they were the ones who started the process of European integration and cooperation. In this church, this is where Robert Schumann is buried, and at the place where he often used to go and attend the Mass there. And his house is now there, made into a museum right next door to a great museum. And we're not going to go on this video trip that would take us through the house, but I'll tell you about what happened at this particular desk where I have sat myself. And those papers that you see just in front of the chair are actually the draft of a 3-minute speech that Robert Schumann gave on the 9th of May, 1950, that I call the decisive moment of post-war Europe. We'll come to that in a little bit. So it was Robert Schumann was the French foreign minister in one of the governments after the Second World War. He had different roles at different times. And it was in his role as French foreign minister that he was involved in helping to set up NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty operation, is it? Organization that right now is having its biggest operation north of Norway since the Cold War. This is because of the great threat that's coming from the Kremlin these days. That NATO was part of one of the projects that he worked on. He was also involved in helping to set up the United Nations, helping to encourage the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, those are all names that perhaps don't mean much to you. Perhaps I'll explain a bit more later. But it was with this tense situation, the big question was, how are we going to receive Germany, a divided Germany? How can we receive Western Germany? What are we going to do with Western Germany in the Western nations. And Germans were regarded as pariahs. That is, nobody wanted to relate to the Germans. And Robert Schuman had to come up with a plan. And the man sitting next to him there, in the left of the photo, on his right, that is Jean Monnet. Jean Monnet was a very interesting character, who actually had a lot of creative ideas, and he worked together with Robert Schuman to come up with this plan that's generally called the Schuman Plan. And the Schuman Plan was this: for a nation to develop a war machine, it needs coal and steel. What if we put the industries of coal and steel of countries like France and Germany and the Benelux nations and Italy, what if they were all put under one supranational authority? That means an authority that was above the nations. Supra means above. That would mean that all these nations would be working together in their coal and steel industries. They couldn't secretly start developing a war machine. And this was a concrete step to be bringing partnership in order to make war unthinkable in the future. And this was in Schumann's mind. And it was a highly secretive plan that Schuman and Monnet were working on, and shared it with Konrad Adenauer. I'll tell you about that. And it was on this day of May the 9th, 1950, where Robert Schuman announced this plan. He hadn't even told his prime minister about it, not fully, and because he felt the prime minister would be against it. And so he called a press meeting, and he gave this talk that only lasted 3 minutes to explain how we need to take concrete steps to build unity and cooperation in Europe. And he knew that if he made it all public, it would be very hard for the process to be turned back. And he was being very wily about this. Now, 3 minutes. I've been talking for longer than 3 minutes already. And 3 minutes is not long enough to really boil an egg or even make a cup of coffee. Yet in those 3 minutes, Robert Schuman laid the foundation for what has become the European Union, laid the foundation of the European house, if you like, in which today 450 million Europeans have been living together in peace. And it's become a major hope and model for the African Union, for example, for Asian nations, for other nations to see now, how can we work together? And I call this a defining moment for post-war Europe, because from that day on, a plan was on the table, and that plan has driven this whole process. Now, we have not followed all the details of that plan. And the whole process of European integration has been lurching from the left to the right, to the left to the right, because it has to be democratic. It has to involve all the nations discussing together. And Robert Schuman can't just dictate exactly how it is all going to happen. This is not a dictatorship. This is a democracy. And the whole process of the European Union is one of discussion. And that's why when you go to Brussels and you go to the European institutions, you see all these translating booths, and you see all these committees, it's constantly talk to find how we're going to work together on all sorts of issues. Winston Churchill once said, jaw is better than war. Do you understand what he was meaning? Talking. We sometimes think, all these people do is ever talk. Yes, they talk, because that's why it's called a parlement. That means to speak, a place to speak. In French, parlement, parlez-vous français? Do you speak French? Parlement. A parliament is a place where all the parties from society come together, and instead of fighting over things, they're talking in order to come to a conclusion. That's a very Christian way of doing things. And the evolution of the parliament really was strongly influenced by the Christian worldview. Loving your neighbor includes listening, giving opportunity to talk, respecting, listening to their perspective. Jesus also said, love your enemy. Now that's hugely radical. So let's go back to the beginning of Robert Schumann's story. He was born in Luxembourg because his father didn't want to live in a German-controlled Alsace-Lorraine. So he crossed the border. He was French, and he found a Luxembourgian girl that he married, and Robert was their only child. Robert's father died when he was fairly young, and so he was really raised by his mother, who was a very devout believer. Now, Robert actually then had to have his education in Germany once he got to university level, went to a number of German universities and became a lawyer. He actually had to change his nationality 5 times in his life because of all the fightings and the changing borders, the First World War, the Second World War. The border kept on changing on top of him. So he found himself, he was French, he was German, he was French, and so on. After the First World War, however, he chose to become French again. And he was given the job as a lawyer of making all the laws of the area that had been occupied by Germany to align them back with French laws, which he did in many areas, but he made sure that there was actually room for Christian-based institutions in that part of France, hospitals and schools and so on, which was not the case since Napoleon in the rest of France, which was highly secularized. But even till today, you find that part of France is still quite different, and it's because of Schumann's influence. Now, at one stage, Schumann, especially actually after his mother was killed in an accident, a runaway horse and carriage trampled over her. He felt like he wanted to become a monk and retire from the world. But a friend of his said, the next generation of saints are going to be wearing suits. We need Christians in the public sphere. We need Christian politicians. We need Christian lawyers. We need Christians who are going to influence and shape society. We need people with a Christian worldview who are going to be shaping the decisions that are being made in society. We need saints in suits. And so that's what made him decide to remain a lawyer. And eventually he was actually encouraged to go into politics. Now, all this time, he remained a very devout believer, and he almost had a monkish lifestyle. He was single. He was devoted to his work. He read Christian devotional books as well as his workbooks. And he was known as a very devout man, and a man of great integrity. And so when the Germans invaded France and occupied Paris during the Second World War, Robert Schumann was the first MP that they targeted to put away in prison, because they knew he was a man of such integrity. He would not be easy to buy and to manipulate. And so they put him into solitary confinement. For 7 months he was there. And while he was there, he was thinking about what will need to happen after the war is over, because he became convinced fairly early on that the Germans would not be able to sustain this war. Now, some years ago, I had lunch
Mhm.
with an elderly Frenchman in Brussels who had worked with Robert Schuman. He was a journalist. His name was Paul Colbert. And he told me that Schuman wrote letters, smuggled letters out of his solitary confinement to leaders of the French underground. And he had seen some of these letters himself. And in these letters, Robert Schuman was writing, we French will have to learn to love and forgive the Germans, to rebuild Europe after the war. Now, can you imagine right now Ukrainians saying that about the Russians? Well, maybe some can. But when you think of the terrible things being done right now by Russian soldiers, it's very hard to want to even forgive, let alone love. But you see, Robert Schuman had been trained in his Christian lifestyle by what is called Catholic social teaching or Catholic social thinking. And this came out at the end of the 19th century. Pope Leo XIII was the Pope who introduced this social teaching. As a response of the Catholic Church to the issues that being raised by the Industrial Revolution. And it really helped to bring the Catholic Church to face the social issues going on, the uprisings amongst the workers and so on, and to counter the influence of socialism and communism, especially amongst the working class. And there were several key elements of this Catholic social teaching. I should have a slide here, but I don't. No. Firstly, they started by understanding that every human being was created in the image of God. We've said this several times. All our politics begins with our understanding about God, and therefore our understanding about man. If there is no God, there's no way of talking about the dignity of man. There's no reason why we need to love our neighbor, let alone love our enemy. We can just look after ourselves. So that's where they started from. Therefore, they said, we are all part of God's creation. We all have the same Father. Therefore, we must always choose for the common good of the whole. That means we must always work for what is best for all human beings, not just our own family, not just our own town, not just our own nation, but work for the common good. Now, this is a very important part of Christian worldview thinking. It leads us to realize that we must always be working for the common good. Because if we're serious about praying the Lord's Prayer and we're praying for God's kingdom to come, that includes God's will being done for everybody. That means that we want to work for the best for everybody. That is working for the common good. And out of that came a concept of solidarity. And that is a term that has been taken from Catholic social thinking and very much part of the European Union language. The word solidarity is constantly being used. It says, we must operate together. We must make a fist together. We must work together. We need solidarity. And that's something that in the Christian world, we haven't always been very good at, because all about denominations, we have stressed why our denomination sees things the right way and the others are wrong. As a Baptist, I grew up with the attitude that we Baptists were the one who had the right doctrine. Perhaps when we get to heaven, we'll find that there might be a few people from other denominations, but they'll realize then that the Baptists were the right ones all along. That was the kind of attitude. And we've had a divisive mentality, whereas we need to have a solidarity mentality, a vision for the unity of the whole body of Christ. Yesterday, I talked about the great split between East and West. And so we've always looked at the Eastern church as being funny and over there, and we don't take it seriously. but most of us coming out of a Protestant evangelical Pentecostal background, we won't even think about the Orthodox Church. They are just under the radar. And the West tended to demonize the East, even during the Crusades. Western crusaders, Catholic crusaders, came and attacked and killed many Orthodox Christians. They sacked Constantinople. That was the headquarters of the Byzantine or the Eastern Orthodox Empire. This is what the Western Christians did. And so we saw them, there was no solidarity there. And so then when the Reformation came along, there was a split between the North and the South, between the Protestant and the Catholic. And we became anti-Rome, anti-Pope, anti-all sorts of things. Now, we might have had good theological reasons for it, but it developed into hatred instead of longing for that division to have been healed. And then we had all sorts of evangelical movements, dissident movements, nonconformist movements that came out of the mainstream churches like the Anglican or the Reformed or the Lutheran. And we set up our free churches. And so I go back 6 generations of nonconformism, not belonging to the mainstream established church. And so you grow up thinking, well, I'm part of this group over here. I'm of Apollos, this is the very thing Paul was speaking against. And so then we had Pentecostal churches started. And even within the Pentecostal churches, like here in Holland, we have all sorts of streams. Now, they don't all come out of splits, but a lot of them do. You disagree on doctrine. And so we have this split mentality. And this is I call it a disease in our Christian thinking very often. Instead of longing for solidarity, instead of longing for the unity of the body of Christ, we accept this idea that, well, our church is the right one and that church is the wrong one. And fortunately, in Youth with a Mission, we hardly even know what the denominational background is of our colleagues, of our YWAM colleagues. We work together, and that's just not important. And that's a very important contribution that we can make as YWAM to help encourage a sense of unity in the body of Christ. Now, I have on my wall, I'm looking at it right now, a statement that the Moravians used again and again, the people from Herrnhut. It says, in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity or love. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. That's a very good motto, I think, for us to have. And so Catholic social teaching said, because we are all children of the one God, we must always choose for solidarity. And they were not just talking about solidarity within the Catholic Church, or even solidarity with all Christians, because they didn't practice that. Popes, many popes, up until just the last few popes, have been insisting we are the only true church. That's changing, thank God. But nevertheless, they also understood that we were all part of the one human family. There's only one race, human race, and that's the human race. So we also need to examine our own hearts to see, now, do we have the spirit of solidarity also with non-believers, or are we always thinking, well, there's them and us? When we see a Muslim woman with her shawl on, do we think, oh, that's one of them? Rather than, oh, here is a woman who's been created in God's image, who hasn't yet come into knowledge of Isa, Jesus. You can see how our attitude towards people from other religions, other races, other territories, and so on, we can have a truly Christ-like opinion, or we have a sectarian opinion. And so Catholic social thinking laid the foundation for a whole political movement in Europe called Christian democracy. And they also taught a concept called subsidiarity. Yeah, okay, that's it sounds a funny word, but I mention it because it is a very key concept in the European Union, and these two words, solidarity and subsidiarity, have been borrowed from Catholic social thinking, and as part of the language of the European Union. Now, actually, it has a lot of relevance for us in YWAM too, because subsidiarity is the idea that only the decisions, that all decisions should be made at as locally as possible, but only those decisions that affect the whole or the larger area should be made at the larger area. Now, this is the opposite from a dictatorship or authoritarian leadership where all the decisions are made at the top. One of the things about the Russian army is that nobody at the lower level dared to take responsibility for decisions. They had to keep on getting permission because otherwise they would be punished for the consequences of the decision that they would take. Whereas in the Ukrainian army, they allowed the local units to make their own decisions. This is what the Israeli army has always done as well. That is pushing the responsibility as locally as possible. In a sense, it's kind of decentralization, but it also recognizes there is a need for government at different levels. There is a need for European levels leaders to get together and decide how are we going to respond together to the challenges of climate or the challenges of migration or economic challenges. We can't solve all those problems at the local level. And that's something in YWAM we need to always remember. Yes, we can be decentralized and operate at the local level, but we need other levels of government to deal with those issues that affect the whole. So this was the social thinking that came out of the Catholic understanding of the Christian worldview. Not only did Schumann get schooled in that, but going back to this other picture here, where was it? Here, de Gasperi and Adenauer were also devout Catholics. De Gasperi lived in northern Italy, in Tyrol, that had been part of Austria for a long time. And Adenauer lived in Western Germany, and he was a devout Catholic and schooled in Catholic social thinking as well. So they all had this thinking, common thinking, even though they were on different sides in the Second World War. Now, Adenauer tried to resist Hitler. He was the mayor of Cologne, and he did not allow the Nazis to put their swastikas on the bridges in Cologne. And because of that, the Nazis tried to kill him. He had to go and hide in a monastery. And so for the rest of the duration of the war, he had to go underground. But all three of these men lived on the borders of their countries. So they were very conscious of the need to reach out to the people over the borders. De Gasperi with Italy and Austria, Schumann with France and Germany, Adenauer also with France and Germany from the other side. And there's a reason why these men were taking the lead to say, now, as Christians, we need to think differently about the people across the border. Most of these countries were ruled by people who had grown up in the capitals and gone to the best schools in the capitals and therefore thought very nationalistically. But these men were different because they'd grown up on the borders as well as having a Christian worldview that gave them a different understanding of the other people. Now, Monet was not an active believer at all. He was a pragmatist, and so he's not quite in the same category. Let's go back now to we've left Robert Schumann in prison. He eventually escapes by dressing like a nun, and he escapes into France, he had to go through 700 kilometers of occupied France to freedom. The Nazis put a huge price on his head for a reward, but he realized that he needed to get out to the free part of France. That was the southern part that was still under, there was a kind of a puppet government under the Nazis, but it was the Nazis at that stage were not present there. They were more concerned with guarding the sea coast on the western side there. But then when he tried to talk to Marshal Pétain, who was the French leader, the puppet under the Nazis, and try to tell him what the Germans were doing with the Jews, for example, and also that he had understood, he'd come to learn that this war could not be sustained by the Germans. They would eventually lose. However, Marshal Pétain was not interested in hearing his story. He was forced to go into hiding again, because now the Germans also took over the free zone in the south. And he spent the rest of the war thinking about, how are we going to rebuild Europe after the war? What kind of Europe would please God? Now, that's a big question that we don't often think in our small-mindedness as evangelicals. And I mentioned yesterday about this concept of Catholics seeing woods, Protestants seeing trees, but evangelicals seeing branches. We don't think much about Europe as a whole because we're so concentrated on our local churches. And so the question is, what kind of Europe would please God is not something that we often talk about in our circles, in our local churches. But this was something very much on Schumann's mind. And as we pray the Lord's Prayer, and I've said it several times, we should realize that this has implications. What kind of Africa would God want? What kind of Asia or nation in our, say, India, wherever we are, what are God's purposes? And I think it can be summed up in one word. It's the word shalom, peace. But it's much bigger and much richer than the word peace in English, because shalom is where everything is rightly related together, where everything is back where God originally intended it. Now, Paul tells us that this is what's going to happen when Jesus returns. He will restore everything under heaven and on earth under his lordship. This is the sovereignty of God over all areas of life. He is going to bring about that restoration. We can say, well, why are we trying to do it now? Well, actually, this is how he moves towards his goal, but we will never fully achieve it until he comes back. But as we saw yesterday with that little video clip from Hans Rosling, we've seen enormous progress in the area of health and well-being. Is that God's will? Yes, it's God's will. He did not want our forefathers to just stay in poverty. He rejoices as he sees us discovering better and better methods of doing things and fulfilling the creation mandate, for example. And so we need to have a vision of what God wants, the kind of Europe, the kind of Africa, the kind of nation God wants that we begin to work towards, because without a vision, the people perish. And without a vision, the church becomes ineffective. We just play church over there in the corner, but we're not effective salt and light in society. And it is this kind of vision for change that has been behind the influence of creative minorities that have shaped Europe throughout the centuries, and why we do these heritage trips. And so this was what Robert Schuman was thinking about as well. How can we break the cycle of vengeance and violence that's gone on between France and Germany especially? How can we create a new order that has been unprecedented in history? The old order in Europe had been set up since 1648. I don't know if you know much about the religious wars followed on from the Reformation as the Catholics and the Protestants struggled. The Catholics tried to win back territories, and what emerged out of all the rubble and the dust of these wars was the idea of an international order based on nation states. Now, nation states are actually a fairly new invention in human history. You can look at Africa and you can realize that the nation states only emerged within the last century, the second half of last century, out of colonies and became nation states. And this was a lot of the thinking about nation states was also inspired by the Bible, looking at Israel, who began as a people and eventually became, as they came through the desert, and they became established as a nation state, and God gave them laws and so on. It's an absolute miracle that these people who were refugees went through the desert and came out of the desert with understanding of laws and understanding of how to become a nation state. And so through the Reformation, leaders were looking at the model of Israel to find out how we should establish nation states. And so Europe was set up on nation states, but then there was all sorts of alliances and ententes set up between these different nation states. There was always kind of a balance. You had the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. France, Britain, and Russia against other countries, and they always had to kind of be in balance. But Robert Schuman saw that this old order was only based on nation states, had led to 2 world wars. Nationalism had failed. It was either too strong, like in Germany, or too weak, like in France. And he said, we need a real democracy, but it has to be a democracy based on Christianity. He said, democracy will either be Christian or it will not be. An anti-Christian democracy will be a parody, which will sink into tyranny or into anarchy. Now, that's a very interesting statement. Very few politicians are prepared to talk about that, to say something like that today. But democracy today is in great danger. It's being undermined in all sorts of ways because we've moved away from our Christian roots. Now, he says the roots of true democracy all came from Christ's teachings, the principle of equality, the practice of brotherly love, individual freedom. That's freedom to do what God wants, not freedom to do what we want, and respect for the rights of the individual. You see, he was he was influenced by a man named Jacques Maritain. Let me see if here we go. Jacques Maritain, Christianity and Democracy. This man, Jacques Maritain, was very influential on Schumann's thinking, and also influencing the setting up of the United Nations, a fully Christian understanding. And so these were the kind of things he was thinking about while he was in confinement. And I'm keeping my eye on the timer. In 5 minutes, we'll have our break. He understood too that loving yourself, your neighbor as yourself, was actually a democratic principle. But we need to apply it not only to individuals, which is what we would do as evangelicals because we're very individualistic, but we need to apply it to nations. What does it mean for countries to love their neighbor nation? That's also a command from Jesus. Being prepared to serve and love neighboring peoples. What did that mean in international politics regarding the French and the Germans, who had been habitual enemies? And he said, if Christianity taught that we were children of the same God, regardless of race, color, social status, or profession, states too should be treated as equals. This is this concept of solidarity. The universal law of love and charity made every man our neighbor. And social relations in the Christian world had been based on this ever since. No race or nation could claim greater importance in God's eyes. So beware when you hear politicians saying, let's make our nation great again. This is what Hitler did. This is what Putin is trying to do. This is what Trump is saying, as well as the nationalistic politicians we have here in Holland and in France. They're saying, let's make our nation great again. We make our nation number one. That is not a Christian thought. And this is the problem we're seeing resurging in our world again today. So what options were there, he said, applied to the community of peoples? Forgiveness and reconciliation, even with those presently seen as the enemy, were Christian imperatives. These are, we have no choice. These are commands, he said, to love and forgive. Again, coming back to the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. This is pretty radical, actually. When you apply Jesus' teaching to the realm of politics, it becomes very radical. He said, the European story was deeply rooted in the Christian story. Cut off from those roots, Europe would lose the foundations for equality, for human dignity, for tolerance and compassion. Europe had to become a community of peoples deeply rooted in basic Christian values. Now, so it was armed with this kind of understanding that he actually found himself as being prime minister for 7 months before he was later then the foreign minister, where we started our story. And he had to face down the trade union communist parties who were trying to undermine the government, and he had to call in the army to break some of the strikes and so on. It was not easy to be prime minister in those days, but it was in these days that he heard about a movement and a center in Switzerland called the Center for the Reconciliation of the Nations. He was on a train trip and he talked to a businessman who'd just come back from a conference there. And he told him about these trade unionists who had brought at the conference, who'd brought a new spirit of reconciliation and cooperation to the labor government clashes going on in northern France. And this was, of course, of great interest to Schumann. And he learned that behind this center was a movement started by a Lutheran evangelist called Frank Buchmann. And so he wanted to meet this man, Frank Buchmann, who started a movement called moral rearmament. You see, just like right now, we're seeing the nations beginning to rearm themselves, recognize they have to face war again. Frank Buchmann's message to the nations was, we need a moral rearmament. We need to be morally rearmed. We need to come back to moral foundations. And so when Schumann met Frank Buchmann, he said, help me, I don't know who to trust in the new Germany. This is after the after the war, as he's now foreign minister, and Buchmann said, I can put you in touch with some excellent people. We have some excellent men in Co, and Co was the place where this conference center was held. It is in Switzerland, not very far from our YWAM base in Lausanne. If you ever go to Lausanne, down one end of the lake is Geneva, down the other end of the lake is Montreux, and right above Montreux is this great big hotel that was built for the world's rich people 120 years ago in a little village called Co. And after the war, that place was abandoned. So this movement had many similarities with YWAM, took over this place and renovated it and made it into a center for the reconciliation of the nations. And one of the people who came to these meetings there was Konrad Adenauer. And that's where he learned about a changed world begins with a change in me. And here is this place. Schumann didn't actually get to visit this place until 1952, but he met with Buchmann several years earlier. Here it is. It looks like a Disneyland building with all these turrets. I've been there many times. Had a wonderful view right out across the lake there. And so it was this relationship, these connections with fellow Christians who had the same understanding of what God's purpose was for Israel, for Europe, that eventually led them to make this bold move to then set up the European Coal and Steel Community, which was the first stage in the process of integration. And just let me finish this, and then we'll have our break. After these two men, Konrad Adenauer and Robert Schuman, and Alcide de Gasperi, the Italian, they were going to go to Paris to sign this contract, this agreement, along with the men from Benelux. And they went to a monastery, the same monastery where where Adenauer had hidden from the Nazis during the war. They went to that monastery, and they had a prayer weekend, a prayer retreat, before they went and signed this document. And Adenauer said to Schuman, I consider it providential that the task of rebuilding Europe rests on the shoulders of men like you, our brother de Gasperi, and myself, who are filled with a desire to build the new edifice of Europe on Christian foundations. Now, I'm going to just skip through here and say, so that's what led to this defining moment of the 9th of May that started the process that is continuing on still today as Ukraine is wanting to join this club too. It was a total surprise, as the newspaper heading says there. France takes the nations by surprise. Schumann's declaration was called the Schuman Bomb, and eventually, 12 years ago, it led to the European Union being granted given the Nobel Peace Prize. And there's a story about that I will tell you. So let's break here, and we'll come back and consider what happened next.
All right. Thank you. And we'll have a 30 minutes of a break, and we'll be back by 10:45, not 30 minutes, 25 minutes. Thank you.
My line back now.
Can you hear me, sir? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
I want to thank you for what we have learned so far. It's so wonderful and mind-blowing. We have learned so much from you. Right now, we're beginning to think on solution for Nigeria and Africa as a whole in our small team here. I know we may be little in number, but with what we have received, we intend to do great things, you know. Though I want to ask a question concerning the issue of fatalism you talked about, because in this aspect of the world, a lot of people, okay, yes, a lot of people, so a lot of people in Africa have this mindset of let's just wait, you know, the salvation gospel coming to Christ, and then don't do it. And then God will come and take us and rapture us home and all that. And yesterday when you're talking about it, though you touched a little bit about on that, and I just wanted to if you can say something and then maybe create a balance about it, because from what we have learned here so far, we were taught that we are supposed to bring solution and that God wants us to live here for eternity. So I just want you to buttress on that if we can have more understanding from you.
Okay. That's a good question and a big issue. The question is, where are we going to spend eternity? Where is heaven? We have this idea heaven is somewhere else and so on. What is God's future even for this planet? And there are all these different schemes that have been presented. And interpretations, for example, Peter's letter, where he talks about a new heaven and a new earth and so on. I could spend a lot of time on this, but I still got quite a bit of ground to cover for the current subject. So I'll just say this briefly. Where does the New Jerusalem, where is the New Jerusalem? Is it up there? Or does the New Jerusalem come down to earth? What does John see? We have this idea that we're all going to be raptured out of here, picked out and taken away to some other cosmos, some place called heaven. Yet, perhaps we've got it back to front. And when Peter, in his letter, first he talks about the new heavens and the new earth. The actual word for new is not brand new, but it's renewed. A renewed heaven, renewed earth. The heavens will be cleansed of all the spiritual influence. The earth, it says, it seems to read that the earth's going to be destroyed and there's going to be a new heaven, as it was in the days of Noah. Well, it says there that the earth was destroyed by water. If the earth was destroyed by water, what planet did Noah land on? Obviously, he came, it was still, the earth was still there. It wasn't destroyed. That's a bad translation. It should be the earth was cleansed. The earth was purified. And so then it talks about it will be purified or cleansed by fire. Now, Peter goes on to say, if this is what's going to happen, then what sort of lives should you live now? You should live purified lives now, not wait for the judgment. And so he is talking about a renewed heaven, renewed earth. So when Paul says creation is groaning, waiting for the revelation of the sons of God, waiting for the, is it destruction? No, it's for the liberation from the bondage to decay. There's a renewal that's coming. So even though we will not see this fully enacted till Jesus comes back, this is the vision that we can live towards now, instead of just being passive, instead of just being inactive. Now, there are people who think, well, God has given us a command to take back our nations, take back our cities, to take back the spheres, the mountains. This is all language used by some American evangelicals. But it's got a power spirit behind it instead of a serving spirit. And a lot of people who are followers of Trump, for example, think, a lot of Christians who think, well, Trump is going to be the key to get us Christians in power in all these places, and then we can take back our nation. It's not the question of getting people in power. We must learn how to serve our societies. So, unfortunately, I think there's been a lot of confusion that's come in by this idea that God's going to destroy this earth. There's going to be no earth in the future. Rather, it says renewed, a renewed earth, renewed heavens. The word is not neos, which means brand new, but it's kainos. That means renewed. God is going to restore his purposes. And restoration is what Peter and Paul are writing about. There's the restoration. So it's tempting to read some of these passages as if God's going to destroy everything, and we just got to make sure we get our ticket to heaven, rather than working towards the renewal, bringing everything under his control. So yeah, I think that's all I'll say on that right now, because there's lots more to say, but it's not been our particular subject right now. I need to get on to the other subject. I see from Malawi, there's also a question. What makes true democracy between Christianity and human mind? Well, we're told, of course, that democracy comes to us from the Greeks, and the word indeed comes to us from the Greeks. And the Greeks had a form of male property owners could share in making government decisions, but it wasn't democracy for all. It wasn't democracy for women. It wasn't democracy for people who didn't own property. It wasn't democracy for the slaves and so on. It wasn't democracy in the sense that we understand it today. Now, this is where John Calvin and Geneva come in very strongly. They understood when when Moses' father-in-law said, get the people to choose their leaders. This was the principle that Calvin picked up and had the people and the congregation choose the elders in the church. And then they said, what's good for the church is good for the state. And so the city council was chosen that way. And here was the beginning of our modern democratic idea. It's also had some other origins. There were in some of the Germanic tribes, and there were also parliaments of which was like a crude form of democracy. But it was Christianity that, as this book shows, how can I? Okay, Christianity and Democracy, Jacques Maritain, and he points out, and this is what Robert Schumann picks up on Maritain, and says that it really does require a Christian understanding of human beings, in which all people are equal. That is the basis for democracy. And so, as we've moved away from a lot of Christian understanding, so we're also undermining. We're seeing the democracy being undermined. And I showed you yesterday a chart, the map of the democratic factor, where democracy is strongest and where it's weakness. And this year's figures have come out, or last year's figures just come out, and it says, that it's actually weaker than it has been. And we are finding that in a post-Christian West, democracy is under challenge, and we're seeing a lot of populism and desire for autocratic leadership. We see it in Hungary, for example, and ironically, it's often done in the name of Christianity. Orban uses the name of Christianity. Putin uses the name of Christianity to be undermining democracy. Okay, that's all I'm going to say right now. Let me share my screen and go back to this picture here. All right, let's see. Make it full screen here. All right. Now, so I finished off saying how the EU was presented the Nobel Peace Prize. And it was kind of ironic. In 2012, Europe was going through a major financial crisis. And people were saying, well, how come, Europe is being rewarded when it's not able to solve all its financial problems? Well, somebody's got their mic on. Yeah. Okay. Actually, it was recognizing that since the EU started as the European Coal and Steel Community in actually that got officially started in 1951, 52. But it was May the 9th, 1950. That was the starting point, because once Schuman had put this plan on the table, there was a movement. There was something to focus on. This is what has brought about the project of European integration that has inspired also the African Union. And by the way, I'm going to I'll put in later on the address of a theologian, a Nigerian theologian. His name is Sunday Agang. I don't know if anybody's had any contact with him. He was actually going to come and work with us for a while here. He's written a book called African public theology, African public theology. And it starts off with a statement that came out of the African Union. What kind of Africa do we want? And it is helping Africans to think, okay, what is our contribution towards that kind of Africa? It's a very good book with essays from different African people and one or two non-Africans, I think. I can't locate my copy right now. But he is somebody who would be available. I think it would be very good if some of you could have some contact with Sunday Agang is his name. And I will send you his email address. I'll put it in the chat box later, because he has a lot of understanding concerning the issues we're talking about. This moment when it was decided for the EU to be given the Nobel Peace Prize, I happened to be in the European Parliament speaking to a group of Christian young people, and we were being hosted by a Finnish parliamentarian. Her name was Sari Essayah. She's actually now the Minister of Agriculture in the Finnish Parliament. And while I was telling these young people the story I've just been telling you about Robert Schumann, she was busy on her phone. There was a lot of activity on the phone. This was before WhatsApp. I don't know what she was using at the time. It might have been Skype or some kind of program. And obviously, something was really up. And so as soon as I finished, she said, now, while Jeff's been talking, I've just received news that of the next stage of this story, and that is
Right.
the EU has been given
They want to do it. No, I'm
Well,
sorry,
see,
I'm
and-
just
and-
saying.
And see, that
Yeah.
that would be a discussion
Yeah.
that the Barches could have with the guys doing the work. It makes no sense to have that discussion with you.
No,
Um,
that doesn't make
I don't know
sense.
what's
Yeah,
happening
I'm not-
here.
But you know what?
I'm
Yeah,
just
no.
trying to.
It's anyway not, they don't charge the work. So it doesn't matter. It's about the payment. So it's
Somehow-
not like another.
I'm just, what
Well-
I am, and that's what I'm struggling a lot with, that we have to take the decisions that I have no clue about. You know, like,
Ezra,
and that
Ezra.
was just, if I just look at, okay, how is it with the pay here? Then it's more like tenants only have to pay if it's like a übermäßige Abnutzung. like
Ezra,
an over-
are you able to control this?
And here I cannot see anything about 8 years. It's more like if it has holes
Can you
from
guys hear me?
France, this in law.
Yes, we can hear you.
What's going on?
Like if you smoke in it and all
hear
that
you.
stuff. So I am not sure if.
Well, I'm
it's
hearing a
actually-
whole other discussion going on. I don't know where it's coming from.
Yeah,
Can you
like
tell
in
me what's
normal,
happening?
if you have. things
Yeah,
on-
I'm sorry, Jeff. Can you give us a few minutes?
Yes,
We need to
yeah.
fix something.
Oh, it's fine?
Now it's good.
Yeah. Sorry,
Okay,
sorry.
continue. Okay, yeah. All right. Anyway, okay, that was what I was just saying was that I happened to be, talking to this group of young people, telling this story when the news came through that the European Union were going to be given the Nobel Peace Prize, which in a sense was recognition of what was started by Robert Schuman. Now, every year on May the 9th, there is Europe Day. It's officially recognized in the EU as being a special day to remember how things started. It's actually remembering why we need each other. Unfortunately, there are some countries that totally ignore it, and Holland is one of them. Hardly any Dutch people know anything about Europe Day being May the 9th. But I tell you what, in Ukraine, they all know. In fact, about 20 years ago, my two sons had a band that was invited by the Dutch embassy in Kyiv to go and play at the big Europe Day event they were having in Maidan, which is the Independence Square in the middle of town. And here were 50,000 Ukrainians celebrating Europe Day. when virtually no Dutch people know what Europe Day is. I went recently down to Brussels as a participant on a tour with 30 Dutch people. We were being shown by journalists through the European institutions. And I wanted to know what these people tell the story, because I'm going to do a walk like that in May. And I asked all the people there, I said, now, we heard about Europe Day here, but who knows what and when Europe Day is? And not one single person of all those 30 people who were interested enough to take the trip down to Brussels knew what Europe Day was. And that's why we hold on Europe Day, or close to Europe Day, every year in the capital of the country that has the presidency of the EU, we have a State of Europe forum where we invite Christians from all different backgrounds and different disciplines to come together to look at Europe today and evaluate the state of Europe in the light of Robert Schumann's vision for Europe to become a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. So last year we were in Stockholm. The year before we were in Paris. This year we're going to be in Brussels because Belgium has the presidency right now. We're not in Brussels because it's the capital of the EU, but we are going there because it is the capital of the country that has the presidency of the EU. And one of the speakers will be the former Prime Minister of Slovakia, Ed Hager, who's a very keen Christian who's been discipled by some YWAMers in the past. Another speaker will be the Anglican Bishop in Europe, Right Reverend Robert Innes. And we look at all sorts of questions going on in the framework of a Christian worldview. So, because we need a place where we can talk about these things. We don't often find places where we can talk about these things. So let me now move over to the next phase, the next topic, and that is what happened with the fall of communism. And here I'm going to talk about a spiritual uprising. Now, we've got 40 minutes. Before then, we have some questions and answers. I want to talk about this, and then I want to also talk about Ukraine. Now, I will send to you an e-book that contains what I'm going to be talking to you about now. It's a collection of stories that I've written about the spiritual uprising that was happening in the countries that were under communism that led to the downfall of communism, how truth, faith, and hope overcame the lies and oppression to topple communism. And it's important for us to remember this, to understand what's going on now, and to have faith that that can change yet again. And so here is the here are some of the different stories I'm going to be telling you, and 3 decades before, it's been 3 decades since the Berlin Wall fell. A whole generation has risen without a living memory of these events. What actually caused the great implosion of a system that had gained control of most of Eurasia? We often hear about, well, it was these figures like Gorbachev who brought in perestroika and glasnost, or Ronald Reagan, Maggie Thatcher, Charter 77, which was a charter, a petition set up by a lot of very brave people, demanding that the Soviet rulers would recognize the Helsinki Accord, which upheld human rights. Is this a case of delayed modernization? They just happen to be on the wrong side of history, and so on. And I'm going to be talking about I draw my stories from people like George Weigel. I mentioned his book yesterday called The Cube and the Cathedral. Michael Bordeaux wrote a book called Gorbachev, Glasnost, and the Gospel. A woman named Fonda Haidt, Candles Behind the Wall, who all pointed out that there were spiritual roots behind the peaceful revolution that toppled communism. Now, let me see. I think I might put you on to. No, okay, that's all right. We'll stay here. I'm going to start with a man by the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Your generation doesn't know his name, but when I was at university, his name was a household name all throughout the West. He was a Russian dissident writer who had been sent out to the archipelago, up to prison out in Siberia. He was arrested for criticizing Stalin and got 8 years of hard labor. And he began to write stories and books that began to expose what was actually going on in the Soviet Union. A lot of leftists were praising the Soviet Union, and a lot of leftist journalists actually became what Stalin would call useful idiots, people who didn't really realize what they were doing. It's like the interviewer who interviewed Vladimir Putin recently, the American. He was what they would call a useful idiot. That is somebody who's being manipulated by the person for propaganda purposes. And these people were saying, "Oh, the Soviet Union is really actually a wonderful place." But through Alexander Solzhenitsyn's writings, the West began to realize that under Stalin, terrible things had happened. And even the Kremlin at that time, under Khrushchev and others, began to discredit Stalin. He was actually awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. And Russia wanted to get rid of him, so he actually lived in exile in America before he returned to Russia. He didn't like America. He was at heart a strong nationalist. But the very important thing that he was, what he said is that men have forgotten God, and this is why all this has happened. The simplest, when he was put on a plane to go to the West, he said the simplest and most accessible key to being liberated, he called it a self-neglected liberation. That is, we have neglected this key to our own freedom, is not to participate in lies, personal non-participation in lives. It's the easiest thing to do is to simply go along with the lie, and it is the most, the easiest thing to do is not to participate in the lie. And this is what destroys lies, because when people renounce lies, it cuts short their existence, the existence of lies, that is. Like a virus, they can only survive in a living organism. Now, so his message was, don't live the lie, live the truth. Don't agree with the lies. And if enough people were to begin to do this, the whole lie system would fall apart. Now, he greatly inspired a Czech playwright named Václav Havel. And Václav Havel started the truth revolution that led to the Velvet Revolution in Prague. Over the last 6 weeks of 1989, the Velvet Revolution in what was then Czechoslovakia saw the non-violent transition of power from one-party rule to a democratic party, a parliamentary republic. It culminated in the surreal presidential installation of dissident playwright Václav Havel by public acclaim in Prague Castle on December the 29th. Thus ended 41 years of communist rule in Czechoslovakia. Now, I never met Václav Havel myself, but I did meet a number of people who were his advisors. And I came to recognize that his story was very, very key for the overthrow of communism. It wasn't just politics. It wasn't just economics. It wasn't just the military power, but there was something that bubbled up from within as the peoples, the populations of these different countries began to refuse to accept the lies that were coming down to them from the top. And Havel went to prison for standing up against these lies. And he began to awaken the conscience of his own people. And he was deeply influenced by Solzhenitsyn and believed in the need for a spiritual dimension in politics, and echoed Solzhenitsyn's exhortation to refuse to live under the lie. He translated Solzhenitsyn's exhortation to his own readers to choose not to sign, write, or print in any way a single phrase which, in his opinion, distorts the truth, not to attend demonstrations and meetings if they are contrary to his desire. Very often the communist governments would say everybody has to be part of this May Day parade or whatever. And he said, no, let's refuse to do that. Let's not go to these demonstrations. To walk out of a meeting, a session, a lecture, performance of a film, if he hears a speaker tell lies or share ideological nonsense or shameless propaganda, that there is a need for this kind of nonviolent protest. And so he wrote an article, an essay called The Power of the Powerless, sharing how loose communities of individuals united in a common cause could undermine oppressive regimes using the weapon of truth. Now, it's very interesting. Václav Havel was not a professing Christian. He may have, on his deathbed, become a Christian. Some people think he did. But he embraced a lot of biblical concepts. And he talked about an epiphany while he was in prison. An epiphany is a revelation, a revelation of love. He wrote about this, but he said, truth prevails for those who live in truth. Now, he was actually standing on the shoulders of a 15th century reformer, Czech reformer, Jan Hus, who was the spiritual father of the Moravians. If you know anything about Moravians and Herrnhut and Zinzendorf, the spiritual father of that movement was Jan Hus, who said, truth prevails. And Václav Havel, when he became president after communism fell, adopted that phrase, truth prevails, as his presidential motto, and it flew on the flag over the palace in Prague. Repeatedly, he would say, truth and love must prevail over lies and hatred. And although he did not declare himself to be a Christian, for him, truth and love had transcendental origins. In other words, origins outside of the human race. If democracy was not only to survive, but to expand successfully, it had to renew its respect for that non-material order, which is the spiritual order, in other words, which is not only above us, but also in us and among us, and which is the only possible and reliable source of man's respect for himself, for others, for the order of nature, for the order of humanity, and thus for secular authority as well. He said, although he wasn't an active churchgoer, he decried the great departure from God in our world, unparalleled in history. The world's crisis was rooted in the spiritual condition of modern civilization, he said, the loss of an experience of the transcendental. Now, this is where he wrote to his wife about his epiphany in prison. I sat on a pile of rusty iron and gazed into the crown of an enormous tree that stretched with dignified repose. I felt a sense of reconciliation, indeed, of an almost gentle consent to the inevitable course of things as revealed to me now. A profound amazement at the sovereignty of being became a dizzy sensation, an unbounded joy at being alive, at having been given the chance to live through all I've lived through, and at the fact that everything has a deep and obvious meaning. I would even say that somehow I was struck by love. He wrote a book called Disturbing the Peace. And he said, as soon as man began considering himself the source of the highest meaning in the world and the measure of everything, that was during the Enlightenment, the world began to lose its human dimensions and man began to lose control of it. This is ironic because the Enlightenment said, no, man is at the center of everything. Man is the measure of everything. Man is now in control of everything. But he said, as soon as we started to think of that, we began to lose control. Havel became the intellectual conscience of international politics. So that's Solzhenitsyn, Václav Havel. Now I'm going to talk about John Paul II, the Pope, because when he was invited to go to Warsaw in 1979, not by the government, they didn't want him to come, but he was himself a Pole, and they knew that when a Pole became the Pope, they were going to be in trouble. The greatest, most unexpected event of the 20th century was the non-violent fall of the Soviet Empire. And Gorbachev, the eighth and last leader of that empire, readily admitted that it would have been impossible without John Paul II. Because when he came to Poland there, and he preached again and again, fear not, don't be afraid. And this gave the people enormous courage. There were 1 million people who came to the mass there, and he was a figure of great hope. And he inspired a shipyard electrician named Lech Wałęsa, who was starting the first non-communist trade union in the communist world. And here we have this trade union was called Solidarność. And here we come back to this concept in Catholic social thinking of solidarity. And then this became a feared word by the communist authorities because a lot of the workers began to rally around this person of Lech Wałęsa. And it was a movement with foundations for a moral revolution. And the workers' rebellion exposed the lie of the communist claim to represent the workers. You see, communism always said, we represent the workers. But then they began to stand up and say, no, you don't. This is not what we want. And at first, the regime felt forced by public pressure to recognize the union. But the Kremlin put pressure on the Polish government to crack down on it. Now, I could tell you a lot about this because I happened to be in Warsaw in May 1981, and I found myself having breakfast at the table next to Lech Wałęsa, just as I'd been speaking to a student conference there about how the kingdom of God was going to come. And I talked about the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of that little stone that came and smashed the statue that represented the kingdoms of this world. And it was just a small stone that smashed that statue, and something happened to the stone. It grew and grew and grew and became a mountain that filled the whole earth. And as I was sharing this with the students, I said how that the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire had come and gone. But the kingdom of God was growing. And Hitler came along with the Third Reich, which was going to last for 100 years, but it didn't even last for 30 years. And now I found myself blurting out in a public meeting in a communist country, the communist empire has come, but it too must be smashed. I thought, what am I saying? You can't say that. You'll be put in prison and so on. And the students told me they wanted to stand and shout, but and clap, but they had to sit on their hands because they knew that the walls had ears. But at that moment, I had my own epiphany. I suddenly realized, hey, I'd never had that thought before. I had believed the enemy's propaganda that communism was going to take over the whole world. And eventually Jesus was going to come and save us just out in the nick of time. But that's not what this story tells, where the kingdom of God, that stone, that empire, that little stone becomes a huge rock and a mountain that fills the whole earth. Now, from that moment on, I began to realize that communism was going to end. And I began to look forward to the ongoing increase of the kingdom of God, because this is what God had promised would happen. And so the next day, when I happened to be sitting at this table in this hotel with solidarity posters all over the door, and Lech Wałęsa comes in and sits at the table next to me, along with his numbers of friends and colleagues, I looked at him and I thought, what's going to happen to him? Will he disappear in the middle of the night? Will he go to prison? Will he be killed? I didn't dare to believe I was looking at the president of a democratic Poland. But all of that's history now. You've grown up with that history. But for those of us who were watching the power of communism, it was difficult for us to believe that this could ever collapse. And yet that's what had happened. And it happened through these small minorities, people who dared to stand against the lies. And that was what Lech Wałęsa did. Because of his Catholic faith and encouraged by the Pope. One of his colleagues was there was a Catholic priest who was very supportive of this movement, and he stood up to 12,000 people standing outside in the snow and said, will you choose for good or evil, truth or falsehood, love or hatred? And he was himself brutally murdered. This was before I saw Lech Wałęsa myself. That's why I thought, what's going to happen to him? And but at his funeral, Wałęsa urged people not to be provoked to violence. And so it was later, after 1989, when Lech Wałęsa actually became the first president of a democratic Poland. So we've talked about Solzhenitsyn, we've talked about Havel, we've talked about Pope John Paul II, we've talked about Lech Wałęsa. Let's go to Lithuania, where there is this amazing place that's just full of crosses. And I've been there a couple of times, and it tells us, there's a story there about how there was this, it happened to be a kind of a place of folk religion and a place of shrines. But when Stalin, many Lithuanians away and sent them into exile in Siberia, some of them died there, and others managed to eventually find their way back to Lithuania. And out of thankfulness to God, they went to this place and put a cross there. And eventually many crosses were there. And some of these crosses were in memory of the people who died in Siberia. But the authorities didn't like it, so they started to pull the crosses down. And then very quickly, overnight, crosses would be placed back there again. And so there was this tug of war between the authorities and the people. The authorities would pull the crosses down, the people would put them up. And eventually there were so many crosses placed there that the authorities eventually gave up. In 1973, 1975, the hill was actually bulldozed and covered with waste and sewage. However, people continued to bring crosses there, and they defiantly kept building their sacred place there. And finally, in 1985, the government abandoned their hopeless task, and peace came to the Hill of the Crosses. Lithuania at that time was part of the Soviet Union. And eventually in 1991, independence came at last to Lithuania, and the Pope visited there and brought his own cross there. Now, let me tell you about the Picnic of Hope, the Pan-European picnic. This took place in 1989, August the 19th, in the middle of summer there. It was a Wednesday. It looked like an innocent picnic that people were having just outside of the city of Sopron, which is on the border of Hungary and Austria there. And later, this was called an event that was the pinprick that burst the communist balloon. And I have been there several times to this place where there's a grassy field, and this handmade poster was sent out calling people to come and have a picnic on this place that was going to commemorate the fact that Poland and Hungary and Austria were going to remove the barbed wire fence between their nations. The problem had been this: the barbed wire fence had been rigged up with a special alarm system that if anybody tried to get through the fence, the alarms would go off. But the fence was very rusty, and it had to be replaced, and they didn't have the money to replace it, and they'd have to get all the barbed wire from the West. And so at that stage, there had been enough kind of change going on with what was called perestroika and glasnost, encouraged by Gorbachev, that they decided, all right, we're still going to have a border and it'll be patrolled, and anybody tries to cross that border will be shot on sight. And but we will take this border, we will take the barbed wire away. And so there were people who said, hey, let's celebrate this. Let's commemorate let's look forward to a Europe that's going to be a Europe without borders. You see, this is on that poster there. It was talking about a Europe without borders, and so they came and they had a big motto: roll it up and take it home. So here you see somebody's rolling up the barbed wire that had been cut and put in the back of his van. But actually, they were waiting. The authorities came, and here was the both Hungarian leader and a Austrian politician, and they were cutting it up to get rid of it. This is the foreign minister of Austria and the foreign ministry of Hungary who were doing this. This is on June the 27th. So now it is now August, and they had this big picnic there. Now, what happened was there was going to be an official party come to this picnic, and they were all waiting for this delegation to come, and there was a delay. For a long time, they didn't turn up, and there were lots of East Germans who'd come into Hungary. They could get to Hungary, they couldn't get to Austria, but they were now having a holiday in Hungary. And they came to this picnic, and they were surging against the wooden border gate when suddenly it broke open and the people started running. About 600 of them got across, and the guards, they were under orders to shoot anyone who attempted an illegal border crossing, but they recognized that this is something very special. All these people were so happy, and there were so many of them, and men and women and children. They didn't want to open up fire, so they called to Budapest, and Budapest called to Moscow, and Gorbachev said, we're not going to have another 1956, which was when the Russian troops came in and quenched the demonstrations that were going on in Hungary at the time. And so Gorbachev was basically saying, we are not going to stop this by force. And so actually there's one of these guards stopped and picked up a child that had gotten separated from his mother and restored it to the mother. There was a whole happy atmosphere there. And the guards eventually got the door shut after 600 people had made the crossing. And they were prepared to even leave their cars behind. All these cars were abandoned, gladly abandoned. And as in exchange for new Austrian passports, you see the photo below, people who got across the border, and they were given Austrian passports now. And so the Hungarian government faced a lot of pressure from East Berlin and Moscow to tighten the border, while the Western governments were urging Hungary to continue the reforms. And this is what led to, in September the 11th, 1989, the Hungarian government finally opened its borders to the West for free travel. This is before the Berlin Wall has come down. Now, the next month in October, it was going to be celebrating, it was a celebration of 40 years of communist rule in Eastern Germany. And Honecker said there, the Berlin Wall is going to last another 100 years. Actually, it didn't even last another 100 days, because on November the 10th, the
Hello.
oh, yeah, okay, I see your hand, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I just have something to ask. We are sharing a PowerPoint, but we cannot see it here. We are still in the first spiritual uprising.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. So you're not seeing what I'm talking about?
not at all. We thought
I'm sorry. Oh. I'm sorry about that. Let's see.
yes, we are here at open borders now.
You see open borders now.
Yes, yes.
All right. So you haven't seen any of these then?
Nothing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry we've got all this time. Okay. Anyway, I'm sending you the ebook that will tell these stories. But this is what we went through. We talked about
No, it's not changing now. I don't see any.
hang on. So I started talking about Solzhenitsyn. Can you see him there?
No,
You still can't see it.
no, we are still at the open borders.
Well, I don't know what's happened. I don't have open. Maybe I got too many things open here. All right, I'll try again and see if I can share. What do you see now?
The truth.
Ah, good. All right. What do you see now?
Yes, we see the presenter view.
What do you see?
Presenter view. The truth teller.
The truth teller. Yeah. Okay. This is Solzhenitsyn, and he's the one who said, "Don't tell the lie, don't live with a lie." And then Václav Havel, A Truth Revolution, and we talked about the power of the powerless, and his book Disturbing the Peace. Then we talked about John Paul II, how he brought hope with his message, don't be afraid. And then we talked about Lech Wałęsa and the solidarity movement, encouraged by his faith, and standing against the lies. And then the Hill of the Crosses. Here we are, all these pictures you didn't see before. And now the Picnic of Hope, and how all these people crossed over the borders, left behind all these cars in order to get these passports, and how that led to the way to the borders being opened between Austria and Hungary, and then within a month, actually, what happened was, we'll say very shortly after the Berlin Wall came down. And that's why Helmut Kohl, who was the Chancellor of West Germany at the time, said that history had been written on that forest road on the way to where the picnic had been held. Then we can go to the Baltics, that is Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, where they formed a huge human chain across the Baltics from the top border of Estonia to the southern border of Lithuania, as a national demonstration on the anniversary, that is on the 23rd of August. So this is just the same week as the Pan-European picnic. It was on the anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and Russia or Soviet Union during at the beginning of the war, that they were going to, they had an agreement that Germany would attack Poland and the Russians would not stop them. And eventually they would both divide up Poland. and the Kremlin always denied that, but now it had become made known under Gorbachev that this actually did take place, and these were Soviet crimes and human rights violations. And so here you can see a photo of all these people down that highway. I mean, it was really quite massive, and they were remembering the victims of totalitarian regimes on this day, the 23rd of August. And here was this, it was all really, you know, there was a spiritual uprising as people were wanting to stand for truth and righteousness instead of the lies and the injustice. Now, also in the Baltics, there was a singing revolution. They had this tradition of great big song festivals, 30,000 singers, 70,000 spectators. And this singing revolution became a place where they all began to sing in their own language instead of Russian, and sing songs that was then an expression of being liberated. So this was the soft weapon of song. Just like when Jehoshaphat's choir went out leading the army of Judah, the Balts deployed, the people from the Baltics just deployed the soft weapon of song against the militarized might of the Soviet Union to liberate themselves from their occupation. And at the same time in Leipzig, actually for about 7 years, there had been prayer meetings on Monday night in this big church where Johann Sebastian Bach used to be the music director, the Nikolai Kirk, and they would pray for peace every Monday night. And this began to be a major, hundreds of people began to come there. And it became a gathering point for, in a sense, silent protests. And so the secret police, the Stasi, began to move in there too, and they would come and sit in the church services. The pastor, he said, well, I've got a captive audience. I'm going to preach to them. He preached to them all the time from the Sermon on the Mount. And eventually it came to a head as the secret police and the police and the army tried to provoke these people into some kind of a violent reaction. Then they would clamp down, but instead the people came out of the church holding candles and sheltering the candle with the other arm. They didn't have any hand to, you know, to do any violence at all. And they came out there and confronted these thousands of policemen and army people, responding in the opposite spirit. And later, the leader of the Stasi, the leader of the secret police, said, we were prepared for everything except for prayer and candles. And there were 150,000 disciplined protesters who then walked through the city following that time. Then the next week, there were 300,000. And this actually, it started on October the 7th was when Erich Honecker claimed that the Berlin Wall would last another 100 years. October the 9th was when this first prayer meeting took place and the confrontation with the Stasi outside. And then that began encouraging nightly marches with hundreds of thousands of people. And exactly a month after, on November the 9th, the Berlin Wall fell. And once that wall fell, it was actually a whole series of circumstances and misunderstandings that led to the guards opening that wall without a shot being fired. And that was just an amazing development. The sense of excitement and euphoria that we all felt. We couldn't believe that our prayers were being answered. Same thing happened in Romania. The overthrow of the dictator there started, here's the dictator Ceausescu, started with when he tried to put this man, the second from the left, Laskus Tokas, in prison. He was a reformed pastor, because he refused to obey everything the dictator was saying. And so his church people came and surrounded his house to prevent the police from arresting him. And then workers and students came and joined, and there was a huge protest that moved across into this town square of Timisoara, and the crowd swelled and they started crying, "Down with communism, down with communism." I was just there in November in the square, and but then pastors began to say, "Wait a minute! Let's not give all these anti-government slogans. Let's pray the Lord's Prayer." And so they knelt there on the frozen ground there, and they began to pray the Lord's Prayer, and for the first time in public. And they began to they prayed the Lord's Prayer. Here's the scene, and they began to chant, "God exists, God exists." And so you can see here the role that Christianity, the Christian faith, the Christian worldview played in breaking the hold of communism. Now, actually, we can go back to the fact that there was in Russia, they had the centennial celebrations of Christianity coming with Vladimir the Great in 988. So in 1988, they had the 1000th anniversary there, and Gorbachev actually allowed a lot of things to happen that made people remember this. And this was really, in some ways, the beginning of the end. It was the acknowledgement of 1,000 years of Christianity. Now, okay, there's lots more I could say about that, but our time is up, and I haven't even said anything about Ukraine. I'm just going to say very briefly about Ukraine. And I see, Ezra, you still got your hand up. Do you have you have a message for me still?
Not really, I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just say, I've got a slideshow and so on, but I won't be showing it because we need to turn over to questions. There was a moment of grace after the Second World War that enabled the nations of Europe to begin to forgive each other and to be reconciled and to start building together. It's not a perfect process, and very often the Christians have been too absent, and it's humanists, secularists who've taken over. And so sometimes this whole project can look like a secular one, but we need to recognize it is our project, and we've let it to be hijacked by people who don't believe in God. And Robert Schuman said this must not just be an economic and technological project. It has to have a soul. Now, you cannot expect politicians to provide the soul. That's not their competence. That's the task of faith communities. That's where Christians need to be involved. But too often, we Christians have not been involved. We as the evangelical community in Europe, we have been irresponsible. We have stood on the sidelines and criticized, and very often it's been in the name of an eschatology that said, "Oh, Europe has to get worse and worse, and God's going to save us. Jesus is going to come back and rescue us. So therefore, we shouldn't try to help this godless project." It's become godless because Christians have not been involved. Now, that's not true that it's godless. There are many Christians involved, and the Catholic churches and the mainstream Protestant churches are engaged in a regular dialogue with the leaders of the European Union. And we have had an evangelical presence there for 30 years as well. We're going to be celebrating that this year. And that started after I had a consultation there for evangelical leaders in 1992, after taking our YWAM leaders to Brussels to have a meeting with an official there who turned out to be a very keen Christian, led a prayer network amongst the staff in the European Commission. And I said, "Oh, we need to have a consultation for evangelical leaders," which is what we had the next year. And then the European Evangelical Alliance said, "We need a permanent presence here in Brussels." And that's what's been there. There are so many Christian groups who are doing a wonderful work of working towards freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of conscience, not only in Europe, but also around the world. I interviewed the EU ambassador or envoy for religious freedom on a Schuman talk some months ago. You could, his name is Jan Feigl. Yeah, you could find that Schuman talks if you're interested. So yeah, perhaps this has been a very different picture about the EU than what you picked up yourselves. Now, if you want to know more, then I would suggest you can go to here. Oh, I just shut my chat box there. You can go to weeklyword.eu, and I have been writing this weekly blog now for more than 20 years, and I've written a lot about the EU. You can just type in the search function European Union, and you'll find all sorts of stuff there about Schumann, about Africa, all sorts of topics. And I promised you I would send you Sunday Agang's email address as well. It has his name. I'll have to find his email address later. Along with the other materials I'm sending you, I'll send you his. He's the Nigerian public theologian, who I think would be very good to give you some input in YWAM in Nigeria. But I was talking about this moment of grace that was given when Christians were able to shape the international order that emerged after the Second World War. If we had more time, I'd tell you about the Christians who were involved in the founding of the the United Nations. In fact, you can also look at the Schumann talk interview I did with Habib Malik, who's was the son of Charles Malik, who was the one of the founders of the UN, and a very godly man, a strong believer. He's written lots of books about Christianity, about the idea of the Christian university too. If it had not been for Christians, we would never have had a universal declaration of human rights. It was Christian groups, church groups, and so on, who insisted that there come a universal declaration of human rights. So this was a moment of grace that really has enabled us to enjoy a relative period of peace for these 70 years, which sadly may be coming to an end. Now, then we move over 40 years. We've just looked at what happened around the fall of communism. And that was a real moment of grace as well. The influence of these spiritual values that came, and we could hardly believe that communism had collapsed like that. Now, the nations of Central and Eastern Europe looked to Western Europe and saw what was happening there because of the initiative of Robert Schuman, and they wanted to enjoy the same kind of peace. This is what made them want to rebel against communism. Communism was not the answer. And this is why they wanted to also join this European project. But now the same thing has been happening in countries like Moldova, even in Belarus, in Ukraine especially, in Armenia, in Georgia. All these nations want to have the same freedoms that they've seen in the West. And so this is the third phase of what began with Robert Schuman. And we need to be praying for moments of grace here. Now, when Russia invaded Ukraine, all sorts of unexpected things were happening. Really, everybody thought Putin's just going to go straight into Kiev and take over. In fact, many of the soldiers, they had their dress uniforms ready for the victory parade that was going to happen through the streets of Kiev. But we know that's not what happened. And the Ukrainians have fought bravely and sacrificially, not just for their own freedoms, but they are holding the front for the rest of the free world. And so we are in an unfinished phase, if you like, of World War II, an unfinished phase of seeing this shalom come in greater and greater measure as nations begin to work together and become a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. And despite the secularism, and despite the godlessness of the West, the Christian values that were planted there, there's still enough influence coming from them that has given us the harmony and the peace that we still enjoy. So those are the three phases that I see after the Second World War. Firstly, with the beginning of the process of European Union, European integration, and then the collapse of communism, and now this third phase where we need to keep praying for the liberation of the Ukrainians and of the Moldovans and of the Belarusians and of the Armenians and of the Georgians and of all the Russians who are held captive by an autocratic, dictatorial tyranny. And we shouldn't just be praying for Ukraine. We need to pray for the long run. Because when we pray the Lord's Prayer, this is in effect what we're saying. We want God's kingdom to come, his will to be done in Russia, in Ukraine, and all these other places, as it is in heaven. So we've started off talking about how Christianity and the Christian worldview shaped Europe in the first place. We saw what happened at the Reformation, how the recovery of lost aspects of the Christian worldview came and also influenced so many parts of our society. And we saw its influence again after the Second World War. Sadly, there are very few books that tell that story. I work closely with a professor named Evert van der Pol. He's written a book called Christian Faith and the Making of Europe. We use that as a textbook for our master's program and our summer school programs as well. But we really need, there's no one book that tells this story about these three phases of European history. Not one that's up to date at least. We can go back 70 years and find some very good books, but I'm talking about what's on the market right now. Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes for question and answer. I'm sorry I've taken so long. Who would like to ask a question?
Thank you, Jeff. It was, yeah, I mean, we just have very less time for the questions. But the ones who are over Zoom, please put your questions on the chat, that it is easy for us to read and for Jeff also to respond well. Yeah, or you send it to us, we can send it to him and he can, yeah. So anyone from here? We'll begin from our, yes.
I have a question about Ukraine and the war. So we saw that the communism could be brought down by the main people who stand up against it. So what do you think could be a solution for this war? Or if we just see the situation, it seems like there is no way out.
Currently, you mean the current situation? Yeah. It won't happen overnight, but Navalny was a very people like Navalny who are prepared to stand up and to be a conscience for the people. This is why he's being killed, because especially since this other politician, Boris is his first name, who wanted to stand in the presidential elections, was refused. And then what Putin has just done is sent him a signal and the whole world a signal: nobody stands in my way. And to make people afraid of standing up for truth. It's the people who are prepared to do what is right and not submit to the fear that is eventually what will bring down tyrants. And it may take a while, but we need to keep praying. We need to keep praying Psalm 94. Some of us are praying that this morning, which is saying, how long, O Lord, how long? And will it take for you to pull down the unrighteous rulers? So there's no easy answer. But if enough people are prepared to stand up for truth, this is the insight that Václav Havel had, and that Solzhenitsyn had. And now we need to remember the Solzhenitsyn again under the current circumstances. And yeah, it's easier for me to say it in a safe country like Holland than being in Ukraine itself. Yeah, thank you for your question. Now I see from Israel, looking at the many challenges facing African and African Christians, how can we inject these ideas of Christian worldview into our political atmosphere in Africa? Now, I know there's been a lot of Christianity has been planted into Africa, but too often it's been simply a message of salvation, getting a ticket to heaven. It's stopped at Luther, it didn't go on to Calvin. And so we have to think hard, what does the gospel mean for our societies, for politics, and so on? This is why I'm mentioning this name is Sunday Agang, and that's a good starting point. Get hold of his book called African Public Theology, and begin, or it should be African Public Theology, and begin reading what he has had to say, and other people like him. You see, the statement that it starts off with is the statement that came from the African Union, is a very positive one. What kind of Africa do you want? What kind of Africa does God want? And then ask God, what role do you want me to play in seeing this kind of Africa emerge? Now, we spend a lot of time doing Bible study in YWAM, but very often it's Bible study to feed our own spiritual lives. We need to do Bible study to understand, what does this mean for changing our society? And that's where we need to recognize, okay, we have a school of biblical worldview, but then we need to go on to do more study concerning, okay, what does that mean for the way we do our politics? And you need more than just prayers in Parliament. You need more than just a Christian as the president. You need to see reforms take place in corruption, in institutions. And that's where Calvin comes in, setting up the kind of institutions that are checks and balances that then became part of the Western way, the American, the British, and so forth, way of conducting government. Thank God for the American Constitution that should prevent tyrants from taking control. Although right now we're in a very dangerous situation with Trump's popularity even amongst Christians in America, because he has no regard for the Constitution. And we have the same thing in Holland with a politician here, Geert Wilders, who's trying to form a government, but he's got a lot of non-constitutional ideas. Now, as Christians, we should know when there's a danger going on, but too often we're only concerned with the church events and spiritual things, and we don't realize this has kingdom implications. So your question, Israel, is one that could take a whole week to answer, and I think you should spend the rest of your life asking, how can we answer that?
I think there is also a question from Malawi. Is it true that fighting between Russia and Ukraine is affecting African countries?
Oh yes, actually, you've heard of the Wagner Group, and Russia is conducting many proxy fights. It helps Russia to encourage, to destabilize nations all across Africa, and both Russia and China are trying to get control of in Russia. Now, the Wagner Group, of course, they were supposed to be mercenaries, and so the Russian government could say, oh, that's not us. But actually, since the death of their leader, who tried to rebel against the Kremlin, and he was killed in a suspicious air crash, the Wagner operations are now being taken over by the Russian Defense Department. And what they are doing is they are offering to nations like, let's say, Burkina Faso, and Niger and so on. We will protect your military junta, that's a military government there. We will keep you in power. And all you need to do is sign over the rights to the mines and so on. And so they are taking over where the French used to be involved, and the French have been expelled from places like Mali. And Russia is taking over control because it wants to get the uranium and from places like Niger, which was essential for the French to be able to have their atomic energy plants. And in this way, Russia's trying to get a hold of France's energy, just like it's been trying to do with the pipelines coming through with Russian gas and Russian fuel to Europe. And so, yes, Africa is right in the thick of this new Cold War that's breaking out, we need to wake up from reality. Now, there was a book written in 2008 called The New Cold War, which I bought at the time, and I started reading it, and I didn't want to read it. It was too scary for me. It was written by a guy named Edward Lucas, who's from The Economist magazine, trying to get this in focus. And the subtitle is How the Kremlin Menaces Both Russia and the West. It's now 16 years old, but what he talked about there is exactly what we're seeing unfolding today. And we've been naive, and we must wake up. Okay, so next question is, do you personally have any materials you can recommend apart from the ones you have introduced to us? Well, I will think about that, and I will send you some links and some names, as well as the files I've been using. You can this afternoon. Okay, now I see there's a hand from Benson. Is there another question?